For this project, I'm working on a Fredrix Blue Label Ultra Smooth Canvas. This works much better, or something with a very smooth surface is going to work much better for this technique than a rougher canvas. And the rougher canvases are going to make it harder for you to get the detail later on anyway, but definitely if you're doing this technique, I do recommend a very smooth canvas. So I start by misting everything off with a spray bottle. And you can see I've got trash bags underneath where I'm working because I'm actually painting this on carpet. So I've got trash bags and a big tarp under me underneath that, and doing that I've not had any problems with serious mess. I will have to come back through and put some paper towels underneath my canvas to soak up some of the water because I use a lot of water for this technique. Right now I'm just getting this base layer of a dark gray. I am using Liquitex Basics. This is the Mars Black and Titanium White. The ivory black wouldn't work great for this. It would get a completely different look because the ivory black is very translucent. So with this, I do recommend the Mars Black. More often than not, I reach for the Mars Black anyway. I don't use the ivory black that often because it is so translucent. I'm not worrying at all about my brush strokes. I just want to get that paint on the canvas, and I need it to stay wet while I do this whole section. So if I need to spray it with water, I will do that. And this, because of the way that I'm painting, where normally I say use an airbrush to mist your painting to keep it wet, with this, I can use a spray bottle because I want to create water droplets and heavy marks anyway. So now I'm coming on top of this with the black. And I was having happen, I didn't realize this at the time, but like the last time I did this technique on a round canvas, my tripod started to kind of lean to one side, and so I'm losing parts of the canvas, but you get the idea. Slowly the canvas is disappearing. Again, all of this is being kept wet. Now I am trying to flatten out some of the bigger chunks of paint as I do this. You get these heavy globs, and those I will work over so that the canvas stays pretty smooth. Now I'm coming on top straight with white. The big thing with doing this technique is that you don't want to try to be too controlling. I can generally control where my lights and my darks are, but that's about it. Detail-wise, the way the water comes out, you're going to have different results, and that's kind of the point of this, is that it's a very free method of painting a background. But it's got a fairly unique look. Move the canvas back into the video frame. Now I'm taking my spray bottle and I am going to spray all over. This paint has to be kept wet the entire time in order for it to work. So if it starts to dry as you're painting, if you paint very slow, then you're going to want to keep misting it. What I'm doing with the paintbrush there is I found a few harder or bigger clumps of paint, thicker clumps that weren't thinned down. So I'm going over them to flatten them out so I don't have any areas that are too three-dimensional in the finished result, because I don't want to paint over big clumps of dried paint. You can see as I do this, I end up with this sort of white film on the top. When I come back through with the hairdryer, that white film is going to be pushed away. It's not going to stay this light at all. Flattening out a few chunks in there that I found. You don't always notice them until you start spraying the water. One of the easier ways I've found when I start to get those chunks of paint in there, or I find them, is I just dab it or kind of flatten it out with my fingers. Like I'm doing there. Just kind of smudge them in. Now here I will take the hairdryer, and this you can kind of control the direction of the runs of paint that you end up with, but it's again back to don't try to be too controlling because you're going to be unhappy if you have a certain exact look that you're going for. I mean, you get the splattered paint running look. It kind of looks like, actually this one came out looking kind of like marble, but I can do this same thing 2 different times, and all of the different times will look a little bit different. So again, don't stress yourself out trying to make it look exactly like mine or exactly like somebody else's. This is one of those, you get what you get. You can see as I do this how the paint and the water just moves away from the hairdryer. And you'll get to stages where you're like, wow, that looks amazing, but it's still not dry, and so it's going to keep changing. There's no way to make that stay exactly how it is. I had to stop and put paper towels under my canvas because there was just way too much water that was running off onto the trash bags, and I was making a mess. So now we've sped this up a little bit so you can see how I'm just pushing that paint around, or the water really, it's more water than paint on the top, with the hairdryer. And this takes so long to dry. This is not a fast process. It looks like the hairdryer is right on the canvas. It is not. That's a couple of inches away or more than that. This camera angle is a bit deceiving. Don't put the hairdryer right on the water. Keep it up a little bit. See, I'm still using my finger to flatten out bumps of paint that I'm finding. It's funny, this one looks more like marble than I usually get. I remember about 8 or 9 years ago, I painted a marble background, and I spent days layering and layering to get that look, and here I've got it in just a few minutes. Wow, I wish I knew about this back then. That would have made that painting a lot easier. Actually, that's one of very few paintings I never ended up finishing. It was a terrible design. You can see I'm kind of aiming the hairdryer in the direction that I want the runs of paint to go. Now this, I actually really liked how it looked, but I knew that because of the way my design was, I needed to darken up some of that background a bit. It was going to be too light in many of these areas. So I'm going to go ahead and add some black paint over this. I had to make sure that this was completely dry before I went on to my next layer. I would have just pulled all of this up. So let that dry. I'm not covering the entire canvas this time. I just needed a section of this to be darker. The funny thing is, and you won't see this on the video, but after I painted the cheetah and the goldfish in, it ended up looking like there was a shadow because of the way that I painted this in an area that I did not want a shadow. So I had to come back through with white and lighten some of this back up. But because this isn't something that needs to be perfectly smooth, you can later on come through and do that, and you can never, like, you can't tell when you look at it that I came back later and adjusted these colors. So I sprayed that with the water again with the spray bottle, coming from the other side now, pushing that the other direction. Now this was one of those things. I had a general idea of what I wanted the background to look like. I knew that my current background was too light, so I had to make a decision on what the best way to darken up or create the shadowed area was going to be. One would be to do what I'm doing here with the water. The next, to have a bit more control, would be to use the airbrush, which I ended up doing in addition to this. Another way would be to do oil over acrylic. If I had decided to work in that, I could easily add this shadow with the oil later on. So it's one of those things where you've got a million different ways to get to pretty much the same end. I just had to decide what was going to make my life easier. So here I decided to go ahead and add the black. The black still wasn't getting dark enough, and so that's where I decided, you know what, after I draw the cheetah in, I'll go ahead and airbrush the black to get the shadow exactly how I want. And that will soften out my background, because this, as cool as it looks, it was too harsh for the background that I needed. But that's where my airbrush, being able to airbrush black to get more of a shadow, came in. And you can do this as many times as you want. You can keep layering like this until it looks exactly how you want. You may have some great layers, you may have some terrible layers. You do want to watch though, if you continue, wow, that wasn't coming out right. If you continue to use white, it will end up kind of looking foggy. So just be aware of that. Don't go overboard with additional layers where white is mixed in with your colors. So I've drawn everything out here. Now, the really cool thing about this is that I actually used a new projector for the first time, and that projector works so good. It's the Artograph 800 something something. I'll link it in the video description. I've been saving for that one for a while. I had an older Artograph that was it was about $80, and it didn't work well at all. You really couldn't see detail. So normally, if I decided that I was going to trace something, I just traced it from the computer and used tracing and transfer paper. This is definitely turned out to be a much easier way to go. I've used it for this one and for the flamingo that the oil painting I'm working on now. So that the newer projectors are really nice. Even when the room wasn't totally dark, I was able to really see what I was doing for positioning my drawing. And if you don't like to trace things out, you can also freehand it. I could have drawn this out on another piece of paper, scanned it into the computer, and then used the projector to project it larger onto the canvas to get it positioned exactly how I wanted it. So even if I'm going to freehand, I'm still going to end up using the projector so that I get my size exact. It just gives me a lot more control over my end painting. And you can do the same with the transfer and tracing and transfer paper, had that backwards, that I've shown you how to use before. So if you don't like to draw straight onto your canvas, that is an option. Now the white that you're seeing on here, the lines, this was done with the General's white charcoal pencil. That is the one that I always use when I'm drawing over acrylic, because you don't end up with pencil lines. Pencil lines are hard to see. You really wouldn't see that on this anyway. But on paintings where you can see the pencil lines, you pretty much always end up seeing the pencil lines with acrylic paintings. So with acrylics, I go with the white charcoal pencil. Now, after I got I painted the entire cheetah in with gray. And the reason for that is I did not want to fight against that background. So I just gave myself a medium tone. Being that part of my cheetah is going to be in black and white, gray was the best choice for me here. So onto the shelf. This is just a horrible mess, but I've got to block it in first because I need to do some airbrushing, but I need the shelf in before I do the airbrushing so I know where to put my shadows. I'm going to be fading portions of this painting from black and white into color. So I'm going to have a bit of an odd look here at this stage where parts are really muted and then parts are brighter brown. And when I paint shelves, just like everything else, I'm just blocking in this base color. I'm not worrying about detail. I'm just blocking in approximately where everything is going to go. You can see I'm keeping a sketchy line or a sketchy look, and those sketchy lines are going in the direction that the wood grain will go. So if any of those end up showing through later, they're just going to look like wood grain. So coming through with a smaller brush and painting in some of that wood grain, just starting to block it in. And I will come back later on and define that much, much better than what I've got here. And this is just layering right over what I previously did. I don't even care if the lines are going the right direction. I do have a photo of wood grain that I use for this. You can find stuff online. There are lots of photos. Just look for a wood fence. You'll see, just look at how the wood grain lays. I've got a few pieces here. My coffee table is actually what I was looking at for some of this, but it's reclaimed wood, so I'm pretty sure it used to be a fence. So I've got that to use as reference. But get yourself a piece of wood, whether that's from a reference photo or a photo that you went and took or an actual piece of wood, and look at the way that the knots in the wood fall. Look at the grain there. I think doing the wood shelves like this is one of those things where we think we know what wood grain looks like until we start painting it and realize, no, that really doesn't look right. So definitely get a reference photo or a piece of wood that you can refer to. This section here, I think, is a really good example of not freaking out when you realize a color is wrong. I was way too light, no big deal, I just put black over it. Don't stress yourself out about every little thing being perfect all the time. You can just go right back over it with the color you really should have put in the first place. So here I'm starting to add more browns because this is where the color starts coming in. Now this would be easier had I done the shelf before I drew the cheetah in. I'm really not sure on this one what my thinking was here, why I didn't just paint the shelf all the way through and then draw the cheetah on top of it, because right now I'm having to go around the cheetah. It may have been just so I knew where the black started, black and white portions ended and faded into color. I don't remember what I was thinking there, but normally I would have just painted the entire shelf, not worried about the cheetah at all, painted right through it, and then drawn the cheetah over everything after, and then painted the cheetah gray so it covered the shelf and the background. So here I'm using a round brush and a liner brush and starting to get some of the wood grain in there. And I'm going to come back later on and add even more. This is just still sort of at that blocking in stage. Now notice that I'm letting this paint overlap over the tail and over the cheetah a bit. I don't want to create a halo around the tail and the cheetah. It's really easy to be so careful to paint over something. You don't want to mess up. You don't want to make those two areas touch that you end up with this halo. I would much, much rather your background overlap into your subject and then have to repaint your subject over than to end up with a ring around everything. So I've got to make sure that these lines go right into that tail so that it doesn't look like I've got a ring. I don't want it to be obvious that these were painted in a separate order like this, that I did the cheetah and then the shelf. I want it to look like the shelf is behind the cheetah all the way through. Again, an easy way to make sure that happens is just to paint the shelf by itself first. So as I add my highlight, I'm taking a second brush and just putting a few brush strokes over it, back and forth. It's a clean brush that has a little bit of water just to soften my edges there so that it's not too harsh of a line. So a few lines, and then I just blend it out with that other brush just to soften it. You can leave it harsh if you want to. You've got so many different types of wood where some of it is going to be much, much more obvious where all of the veins are. Mine is fairly soft. Just keep layering and layering until it looks how you want. You do want to make sure that each layer is dry before you put the next layer over it, or you can end up causing the previous layer to lift, especially if you're using cheap acrylic paints. I say cheap, but I guess technically the Liquitex Basics that I like so much would be considered a fairly inexpensive brand. But some of them, the Reeves were a really bad one. Lucas were a bad one. A lot of these bargain brands, they will lift. You put down your current layer, you go to put your next layer, and the first layer will lift. So you have to be especially careful with those that they're completely dry, but those tend to lift even when dry, at least a little. Just very sketchy. I'm not pushing very hard with that brush. I don't want real heavy lines. So I went through and airbrushed it, but apparently did not record it, which is kind of fine because it's pretty basic. All I did was use the black airbrush paint and I added a shadow straight underneath the shelf and underneath the bottom section, the bottom right of the cheetah, and along the right section of the background, which you'll see later on. I just lightly airbrushed that black. And then now I'm coming back through and cleaning up my edges where some of the airbrush paint softened up more than what I wanted. Now for these lines, sometimes I'm using black, sometimes I'm using white, sometimes I'm using unbleached titanium white, which is one of my favorites. I'm using different colors to get this wood grain. Don't try to do it all with the same shade. Don't think, oh, here's my white. I like how the white looks. I'm going to do all the lines with just that. It won't look right. You want to use quite a few different colors in there. I would say at least 3, black, brown, and white or unbleached titanium white. And if you want your surface to look smoother, like this one has a very rough look, if you want a smoother look, you can glaze a base color over everything. So it's almost like staining the wood. If you wanted a cherry wood or whatever, mix that color and you can glaze it over the entire shelf, and it pulls your lights and darks together. It gives you a much more polished look, if that's the look you're going for. I left mine very, very rough because I do like that grittier look for this piece. And I think this gives you a good idea of how much layering I do. And this won't even be done. I will come back later on before I finish the entire piece. And I don't think I recorded that on the video because it's the same thing that I'm doing here. I just keep layering until I get that just how I want it. So on to the goldfish. I'm going to do a lot of this in real time. I'm using black to start with. Now, I did the same with the goldfish as I did with the cheetah. I painted them gray and then, painted them gray, and then I filled in the detail with the white charcoal pencil over that to use as a guideline. Now, these guys have a very velvety feel. Or look, I should say. I've not actually touched them. But the way that I'm going to be blending the whites and the lighter colors into that will help to give me that very soft velvet feel. There is some water mixed in with the black paint that I'm using here. I've also got a little bit of a reddish brown, I forget what color that is, that I'm mixing in with this. I stopped being lazy and went and looked. That reddish brown is burnt sienna. But I'm mixing that in with my brown or my black. You can see I've got a little bit of a foggier look here. I don't want this to be straight black because then my black shadows won't really show up. So I'm starting with a more mid-range color. I'm not going straight to the darkest here. Now when you're painting with acrylics, if you make a brush stroke and you can see this sort of grainy look where you see the little dots of the canvas, the previous layer show through, whether that's the white canvas or whatever your previous color was, that's called dry brushing, and it looks terrible. You shouldn't do that. People do it all the time, and there's a lot of books that will teach you how to do it. There are very, very few instances where dry brushing is the right choice if you're trying to make a realistic looking painting. One of the things that a lot of people think that acrylics, or they assume acrylics aren't as good as oils, are because I think a lot of acrylic artists are using these dry brushing techniques that don't look like oil paintings. If you can work and master working wet into wet, which is more what I'm doing here, that gives you a look, the finished product does look like an oil painting. You shouldn't be able to look at my oils or my acrylics and tell which one is which. When they're both varnished and they both have that gloss to them, they should look exactly the same. So if you're getting those little dots, the little bits of canvas from your previous layers showing through, that means you need more paint and a little bit more water on your brush. And I know what people are thinking, but I read in the book that that's a good method to use. It's an easy method. It's a shortcut that never really looks as good as it will as if you paint wet into wet. It won't look like an oil painting. It won't have that smooth look. And here I'm just looking at that reference photo, getting an idea of where the darks go. Now, if you're working on a really smooth canvas like I am here, dry brushing's not as big of a deal. The canvas is very smooth, so the paint's really not catching on the tops of the tooth of that canvas. If you're working on a medium or a heavier textured canvas, then it's a lot harder to avoid that dry brush look where you get the little dots all over the place. Okay, now the belly of this fish is going to be orange, kind of a dark orange. But if I just paint orange over the dark gray that I have here, it's not going to show up. Orange is just too translucent. The same with yellow. So what I've done instead, I have mixed white, which is very opaque, in with my yellow, and now I'm painting that in first. I'm going to put the orange over this after this dries. But by putting these lighter colors in with the opaque colors first, that's going to allow my orange to show up later on. But no matter what I was painting, let's say I wanted a rose on here, a red rose, I wouldn't just start putting red over the background, that dark gray background. It wouldn't show up. I would first paint that rose white, and then I would go over it with the darker colors. That would let my reds really pop. But trying to get red to show up over gray, it's not really going to work for you. Unless you're painting it super, super thick. Like if you were working with a palette knife, then yeah, the red will show up. But the way that I'm working here in these lighter layers, you want to get this opaque color first. I think that's one of the biggest lessons in this painting is when you want to get a lighter color, put an even lighter color. Use white, use your opaque color first. Then when that dries, you can put your other colors over it and they'll really stand out. I'm taking a lighter gray here. I just mixed black and white together. These fins are going to have a bit of a see-through look to them, and so I need to make sure that some of that background color, the lighter gray, is showing through, or it appears that way. If I were painting this over a blue background, I would pull pale blues or whatever background color there, purples, whatever it was for the background, I would pull those colors instead. And I do this on all of the fins. I'll do this here and the ones in front and the one on his back. I want to make sure that these lines go in the direction of the fin. Now, I am not going for photorealism like I did for the clownfish recently. Here I'm being quite a bit looser on the entire piece. So I do want to make sure though that these, even though the fins, the lines that I'm doing here aren't exact, that they are going in the right direction. And for this painting, I'm really depending on my design and my lighting to create this realistic look, to make the piece have a strong feel to it. Whereas in other pieces, like with the clownfish, I depended on accuracy, detail, everything being those teeny tiny lines, everything was exact. So it's not, when you're painting, it's not that one way, the only way to make something look realistic or the only way to make something look good is to do tons of tiny detail. You've got lots of ways that you can achieve that. Sometimes it's like this, I'm keeping everything looser, but I'm depending on the strength from this is coming from my design and my lighting. But don't feel like every single painting that you do has to be super, super detailed. It just depends on what you want to paint that day. So where I'm adding the gray here, I'm smudging that into the darker areas a bit. I add the line with my round brush, and then I'm taking a stiff round brush and just smudging that out. You'll often see me use a mop brush to blend. That won't work here because I'm blending wet into a dry area. The mop brush only works when you're blending wet into wet. I really need to make sure that I separate the eye here because this does stick out from his head quite a bit. In order to make it not look flush against his skin, I've got to really pay attention to where my shadows are. For the tiny areas, I'm using a liner brush. This one is a synthetic hog hair liner. For the larger areas, I'm just switching to a round brush, which is kind of like a liner brush. It's not quite as long and the bristles are thicker. Remember, when you want tiny, tiny lines, you're going to get those by barely letting that brush touch the canvas. If you push very hard, you're going to get the thicker lines. And I do have a video showing you how to use a liner brush. I will have a link for that in the video description. So now look what happens when I come over this with the black, because I used this muted color where it was the Mars black mixed with the burnt sienna. Now when I come on top with the black, it really shows up. Now I can get these darks without just having this solid, totally black fish. But I end up with a lot of dimension in doing this. It's really easy to look at something and say, it's a black fish, I'm just going to paint it black. Look closer. Pay attention to the values you've got in there. Now for the hint of scales here, I'm just dabbing little dabs. Technical term. I'm paying attention to how those scales curve around the belly because that belly does stick out quite a bit. So you can see those black lines that I did that are right up against the yellow, they curve. Coming on top with the yellow mixed with the titanium white again. Just like before, if I just went with yellow or just with orange here, it's not going to show up. So I've got to use this yellow and white mixed together to make it look like these scales fade up. I've got to follow the curve of that belly for these. Now you don't want to just create polka dots. You want to pay attention to that reference photo. I've got variation in all of these lines that I'm doing. And right now it looks very scary, like, wow, that is bright yellow. It's not going to stay that way. But it has to be this way to start with. And I could have used just white and not used yellow at all. That would definitely have worked just as well. I went with yellow just to get an idea because it messes with my head when it's solid white. Here I knew it was going to be orange, so I just went ahead and used yellow because it was a little bit closer than white would have been. Now with this orange, that is super bright. It is not going to stay that bright either. But look at how much that, I mean, if I wanted bright, look how well that pops now up against the dark colors. If I use this color over black, it is not going to show up. You can see even here, I don't even have to be careful. I'm going over the light and the dark here. You can't even really tell that much where I went over the black. I tint the color a little bit, but it's not orange like it is over his belly. And I'll have to come through and darken that up because that's still way too bright. Add a little bit of brown in with that orange. The brown is pretty translucent too, so it still allows that orange to show through. See how I pulled that up on the side of that, like the darker gray on the eye. Let that fade out. What I'm doing here, this is just tinting the color because it is so translucent. That orange and the brown, if I needed those to really stand out, I've got to do the light color first. But here I can just glaze a little bit over the tail and it adds that little bit more depth into the color there. A little more dimension versus being just flat gray. And I'm going to come back through later on with some magentas and blue and purple, which will make him look even better. It'll make him definitely stand out against the background. Now here, if you look at what the background is now, this is what I was talking about earlier, where that background just had this weird shadow, and you'll see it again when I back out with the whole cheetah. It's too dark there. That goldfish is just blending into my background more than what I want. And so when I came back through with the white, it really helped push the goldfish forward. And the white, I just went over the background and smudged it out. I added it with a filbert brush and a Taklon bristled filbert, and then I used a stiff round brush and just smudged it so it faded into the rest, so it didn't even look like I painted it separately. But it definitely pushed the goldfish forward. And helped because it looked like there was a weird shadow. It looked like I had shadows on both sides of the cheetah, which wasn't right. It was just how that background had come out. So I'm adding black and just smudging that out. And there would be no way, had I started with a solid black fish, there'd be no way for me to really create these shadows that I'm doing here, because I would have gone too dark everywhere. And look how nice this looks now that I do have the ability to come through with the shadows, which also helps in creating this sort of velvety feel on the fish. I'm going to smudge those out, just soften those lines a bit. I don't want to overdo it. And I think that's something that a lot of people will do when they start blending like that, is that they will blend and blend and blend and blend, and they end up with kind of a ring all the way around whatever area they were blending. They overdo it. They lose their contrast, their definite light, their definite dark, and then have this weird ring to top it all off. Don't overblend. I just need to do a couple of strokes and then done. This is definitely a less is more sort of thing. Building up the scales there, just a few dabs here and there. Now I'm taking that lighter color that I mixed with the yellow and the white and adding a few highlights. One of the things that I do every time I paint fish, on the ends of the fins, I do white dots. Whoops, that came out terrible. I've got to get rid of that. Take a little bit of water, paper towel, dab that off. But I add white dots on the ends of the fins, so it just has that kind of sparkly feel. It's a very stylized look. It's not necessarily making it look more realistic. It's just how I've painted fish for very many years. I do a lot of these little dots, which gives them a very sparkly look. They're really the only thing that I do that stylized feel with. What I'm doing is making it look like the white is catching the light is catching the edge of their fins. Look how it separates that too from that background. Few little shiny highlights. What I'm doing, you'll see me dab my finger on a lot of this. I'm just softening it so it's not such a harsh line. It just smudges it out a bit and it softens it quite a bit. I'm going to use some of my transparent mixing white. This is the heavy-bodied Liquitex. They don't have this in the Liquitex Basics, but it's a fairly translucent color, and it's definitely going to help me with getting that velvety look for some of the highlights that I'm doing here. And I think this is a good stage to back it up a bit and look at where this goldfish started, how horrible it looked, and where just layering and layering and layering starts creating all of that depth and dimension, whereas originally it looked super flat. So I added the blue. I'm going to come back and mess with that blue later. I'm not going to do too much with that now because I am going to come back through with the magenta, but I'm just going to wait until I'm using it at the same time on the cheetah. Coming back through with a little bit of black, which makes the whites pop even more. And it's one of the nice things, one of my favorite things for sure about acrylics. There's no amount where you're not going to be able to keep layering. If you get to a point you're like, wow, that looked terrible, layer over it. It is no big deal. Don't be afraid of mistakes here because you can go over anything. You can just keep layering until it looks good. So I'm going to speed through this second fish quite a bit. It's just the same thing as what we did on the first one. Now for both the fish and the cheetah, this is a painting where my reference photo is, I don't want to say that it's not good. It's actually, the goldfish, those were photos I took myself. The cheetah is one that I got from wildlifereferencephotos.com. So if this is one that you want to paint, you can go purchase that there from them. But the lighting wasn't that interesting. The detail, not that great. It wasn't the greatest photo for doing, like if I were going for photorealism, this is really not the best photo for that. But the angle, I loved the angle that the cheetah was sitting with his back turned. I changed his tail, but the rest of that I kept pretty much the same. So in this case, here's a painting or a photo that there were things that I liked about the photo and things that I didn't like so much, the same with the goldfish. So what I'm going to do is get kind of creative with it. I'm not going to make this piece interesting by having interesting lighting on it. I just can't see where that lighting falls. I'm going to go with pretty much what is on that reference photo. I hyped up the contrast a bit, but for the most part, I went with the reference photo. What I did to make this look more interesting was the design by including goldfish with this, but I left half of the cheetah, the side to the right, is going to stay black and white. So it gives you something interesting to look at that isn't just interesting lighting. The flamingo that I painted recently, that had some of the most gorgeous lighting. I love that reference photo. But I was depending on the lighting, and there was good detail on that as well. Here, this reference photo just doesn't have interesting lighting at all. But that doesn't mean that I can't make it an interesting painting. I'm getting creative. I'm leaving part of this black and white, and there are probably other options I could have gone with as well. But you don't feel like you have to go exactly with what the reference photo is. Get creative. If it's a photo that you like this one, but that doesn't have good lighting, just get creative. And the painting that I'm working on right now, you guys may have seen some of the posts over on Facebook or Instagram. I'm doing another flamingo. This one is an oil painting on an oil primed linen canvas, and it's the same thing. The reference photo, it was one that I took. I loved the angle of the flamingo, but the lighting was very uninteresting. The color saturation was kind of weird. It just wasn't the greatest photo. But I'm making it interesting because, again, I'm doing like I did here, where I'm fading black and white into the color, and I'm making a lot of adjustments there. So even though it's not necessarily as good of a photo, actually it's nowhere near as good of a photo as the last flamingo reference photo that I worked on, and I feel comfortable saying that because I took both those photos. It's still usable. It's still a great angle. It was a good shot of the flamingo, just very uninspiring lighting. So I'm going to make adjustments on the crop of the photo, and that's actually going to be one that you guys are getting for your reference photos this month. I'm making a lot of adjustments. So on that one, just kind of keep an eye on Facebook and Instagram if you want to see the changes that I've made to take a mediocre photo and still be able to use it in a way that makes it interesting to look at. Okay, so on to the cheetah. I'm loosely sketching in where these blacks go. I'm not making this perfect, as you can see. I'm just kind of blocking these in. Now, what I am doing on the area, especially where the hair is a little bit longer, the top of his head, the roof of his head, and his neck here, I need to make sure that these don't just look like flat spots. I need to make sure that I am moving that brush in the direction of the fur. And while I'm not going super, super realistic on this, I am still wanting it to look realistic enough that this just doesn't look like polka dots all over the place. I've got to make sure that I am moving the brush in a very sketchy line. Now this brush, I'm kind of sad because it's one of my favorites, and it was a generic one from Hobby Lobby. Years ago they made them where it's a double-ended brush. They don't make them anymore, and they don't even make this type. It's almost like a sable. I love this brush so much, and I can't find a good replacement for it. But it's gotten damaged over the years because I have used it so much. So not giving me a perfectly smooth edge, but it does work really good with fur because the bristles are kind of spread out a little bit, so it helps to get that very sketchy, rough look. So sometimes when you have these brushes that you're like, wow, this is ruined, don't throw it out because they can still be used for different techniques like what I'm doing here. This brush is great for what I'm doing now. If I were trying to draw buildings or something where I wanted a smooth edge, not so much. I've got to keep looking at that reference photo. Now you can see I do not have all of the spots. You'll notice me putting in spots where they aren't on the reference photo. I'm not copying that photo exactly. I'm balancing mine out for what I think would look best. But I am going for close. I am trying to make sure that this fur bends and moves in the right direction. And this is especially important. He's not at a normal angle. He's turning his head. That fur twists and turns all over as it goes down his neck and his spine. So I've really, really got to watch the direction there, and I've really got to watch how long each of these brush strokes are. I don't want to make the hair look really long where it should be short, or really short where it should be longer. He does have longer fur on the back of the neck and around the shoulder blades here. And so when you look at this, it's like, wow, that is a mess of black. What are you doing? I'm looking at the reference photo. It doesn't look right now, but I know that it will. I've just got to trust that reference photo. See how very sketchy these are. Now I'm going to come back through with fur anyway, and a lot of this is going to overlap, but I don't want perfectly smooth black lines for these spots. The same thing if I'm painting a tiger, I mean, besides the line coming from his eye to his mouth, for these areas where I need this to look very furry, I don't want perfectly black lines, because when I come back through, even if I know I'm going to paint over parts of these, I'm going to be fighting a harsh line. I don't want to fight those harsh lines. I want to keep this nice and sketchy so I end up staying with a very natural feel throughout. Now, if I were to paint this entire cheetah all in color, I don't think I would have used gray as my background here. But because I'm going to be fading part of this from black and white into color, that's why I went with a gray base tone. But if you're going to do all color, it would be easier, I think, to go with a darker brown tone instead of gray. That way the brown tone is what's peeking through. So we're going to go through this really quickly. It's just a rinse and repeat sort of thing, making sure that I'm watching how those spots look, making sure they're sketchy where they need to be. Now look at here where they go down his side towards his stomach, where they start to flatten and elongate. That's important in making sure he looks three-dimensional. I don't want the same size spots where they're kind of oval in the center to be the same on the sides there, because that wouldn't make sense. It would totally throw off the perspective. So even if your drawing is perfect, if your spots are wrong, or in this case, if they were just round all the way from one side to the next, you're going to make him look very flat. Part of what's going to make him look three-dimensional is in the fact that those spots change shape when they get onto his side. They're longer and thinner. Here, where you're facing, those spots are facing the viewer, that's where they're going to be more circular, I guess. Then they get into a thinner, more oval shape out towards the side as the body curves. And that's going to be the same if you're painting tigers or leopards. The stripes and the spots are going to change shape completely depending on how the animal is bent. Bent is not the right word. How he's curved, how that body is curved, how that rounds out. Now, I have people ask me a lot, well, how do you know what color to put there? How do you know what layer to do next? It's experience largely and a willingness to experiment. I've not painted a cheetah where he faded from black and white into color like this, so I just had to experiment. I have to be willing to fail and maybe have to start from scratch. That sometimes might happen, but being an artist, you experiment with things. That's what you do. You have to try different things out and figure out how to make something work. So it's largely trial and error. It's not that I magically know all the answers to things. It's that I will experiment until I get the results that I want. So here, I want his entire face is going to be in color. So I've got to paint over all of this gray. I'm just paying attention to that reference photo, trying to watch where the lights and darks go. Now, this is going to go through some seriously ugly stages. Don't be afraid of those ugly stages. They're going to happen. Sometimes they'll be worse than others. This is going to be a bad one. But you just keep layering until you get it to look how you want it to. Don't call it finished too soon because you're afraid to mess up. You can keep on layering. Knowing when something is finished is really as simple as looking at it and saying, is that what I wanted it to look like? If it doesn't look what my goal was, then no, it's not finished. If you're trying to make it look just like a photo, does it look like the photo? If not, it's not finished. I realized that I had part of the face drawn wrong, so I'm having to repaint part of the background in. I'll fade that out more later. That's the nice thing with having a solid black and white background and something this messy. I can easily hide mistakes. If it was a perfectly smooth background, there is no way I would have gone over that with acrylic and had it fade out smoothly. So as I'm sketching this in, I'm still going the direction of the fur, and some of this is going to go over the black. No big deal, but I can still see the black. The point of putting the black in first, all of those spots that I did on the entire body, even though a lot of this is going to get painted over, I'm still going to see that black through it. That black is going to show through everything. So I'll go back through later and clean them up even more, but right now it just made my life easier because I know where all those spots are. They're all blocked in. They work as really good guidelines when I lose my place and I'm trying to figure out, oh, what goes here, what shadow goes here. I can figure out which spot was which if I've got them fairly close. And that will help me judge where I need to make things lighter or darker. They're like maps. Now here I am mixing unbleached titanium white with my burnt sienna, and where I need to make it a little bit more brown, I'll add a little bit of black. If you mix burnt sienna and black, you get a nice kind of a Van Dyke brown. You can just use brown if you want to. I was being lazy and was just mixing the two colors together to get that. Now these brush strokes, all of them are going in the direction of the fur. Even though they're not going to be anywhere near my final layers, I'm still in the habit of painting the fur in the right direction. So if something does show through, I don't cover something completely, it doesn't matter, it's going in the right direction. Now, looking at this, it's hard to imagine that this is ever going to look halfway decent. Just keep layering. I know I keep saying that, but it's a big deal, and it's something that I've seen with students over the years where they're so worried about messing something up, it looks bad, and they give up. So here is my burnt sienna mixed with a little bit of black, which gives me this really nice chocolatey color. Starting to build the shadows. Now I've got to get my darker areas dark enough so that when I come back through with the lighter highlights that they'll show up. So I'll intentionally come through and make things way darker than what you would think it should be. When you look at this area of the reference photo, it's not that dark, but I've got to have it dark enough so that when the lights go, they have something to show up over. So building up these shadows. Using a stiff round brush there to smudge that out. Now I can still see my black spots underneath, so I'm not worried about losing any of that. As you can see, as I'm blending this, look at how all of those black spots, they still show. I'll need to come back through and make them darker, but I can still see where they go. And it makes it so much easier for me to guide or figure out which direction the fur goes based on having those black spots as guidelines. Cheetahs, they're not dark brown like this, but watch what happens later on when I come through with the highlights. Just going to smudge that out with the round brush, and this is where I'm blending wet into dry. Wet into wet, I'll use a mop brush. Wet into dry like this, I will use a stiff round brush. And this is one, do not overblend. If you keep using that stiff round brush in the same area and blending and blending and blending, not only do you lose your lights and your darks, you end up creating a ring where you push all of the paint to the edges of the area that you're blending, and it looks terrible. See how I'm just really focusing on the edges themselves, mostly leaving the center of these blended areas alone. Just softening those edges. Just a few strokes, that is all. And I think this is one of the harder things for people to get used to, is blending the wet into dry like this and having that soft transition, mostly because people want to overblend it. They want to keep blending. Just a couple of brush strokes. I'm taking that brown color and going over the inside of the ears too, so they're not just flat black. Now this area, it's going to be white, but I'm painting it first with this cream color so that I have this darker color that will show up under the white. All of these areas will be white that I'm doing with that sort of cream color. Peach, I guess, would be a better name for that than cream. For an artist, I sure don't know my colors. This will be white too, but I need that base color first. You can see that black that I did totally shows through this, so I can paint right over it. And I'm not painting this on really thick. If I were painting this very, very thick, not much water, then yeah, I would end up covering too much of the black and I wouldn't really be able to see it. But there's not that much paint there. I'm thinning it out a bit with water, which makes it even more translucent. And figuring out how much paint to use on your brush, that's just going to come with practice. There's no perfect formula. It's definitely a practice thing. I will say though, statistically, more often than not, students are not using enough paint on their brush. Not enough paint, not enough water. There are always exceptions to that, but usually that's the case. People are trying to make their paint last way longer than it should, and that kind of looks terrible. Don't be afraid to use the paint. So I'm going right over the spots. Don't even worry about that. This is a pretty thin layer that I'm doing. Now, if I were to be mixing white in with this, white's more opaque and that would start to cover the black where I couldn't see it anymore. But here, I'm just using the burnt sienna with a bit of black and some water. So those are all translucent enough that I can still see my spots through. If you've painted big cats before and you felt you weren't doing a great job, this is a stage where I see a lot of people stop and call it finished. And obviously this does not look like what my work normally looks like. Not because it's bad, not because it's wrong, because it's not finished. Just keep layering until it's how you want it to. Don't feel like, oh, I'm just bad at this. No, you're just not finishing it. There's a big difference. So we'll speed this up a bit. I'm coming back through with more of that burnt sienna, making my colors much more rich on this section. Now I'm using unbleached titanium white. This is an older filbert that's a little bit damaged, and so I get these streaky little, they look like fur lines on it just from trying to make a normal brush stroke out of it. So this is one that I've kept that works really well for that. I'm gonna start building up the fur here. I'm adding the light colors now. I'm going to take some yellow, brighter yellow, and I just put that over the bottom section of the eye. I'm going to take the burnt sienna on the upper section, and I'm going to smudge those two colors together. I've got a little bit of the unbleached titanium white mixed in with the yellow there. It's going to take a few layers for me to get the eyes to look how I want. So I need to let that dry. We'll go ahead and add some highlights now that that layer is dry. I'm smudging that with that little round stiff brush. Whoops, too much. Smudge that out more. And I don't want the eyes just to be one solid color. They'll look flat. Not that they look very good right now. I'm working on it. So I'm going to better define the black now. Notice right now his eye looks like he's just kind of staring at you. See how I've got the lighter color above the pupil there? I've got to come back through and add a bit of a shadow in that section. I need to wait for what's there to dry or I'm just going to smudge everything. But it's important not to just have bright color all the way around or it looks like an owl where it's really staring. I'm using a lighter gray for a little bit of detailing on the rim of the eye and that inside black section. And the eyes are going to look especially weird until you put the highlight on them. I think this area where his eye, that black patch or black section connects down to the mouth, it's really easy to want to leave things like that just straight black. But more often than not, you've got to do some shading in there. Things that look black have shadows or reflections coming around them. And so here I've got that lighter gray. I'll come back through with some blue as well. But if you leave everything just flat black, it looks flat in the end. Gonna start adding the highlight here. Well, that was a mess. Just dab that and go over that again. Look what an instant difference that makes too, putting that highlight. And that highlight's not finished, but even that little amount really does make a difference. Notice that it is slightly curved. And on my reference photo, that highlight was pretty flat, just the way the reflections were and what it was picking up on. But I want to curve mine a little bit. And even when I do this, mine's going to be a little bit too straight. I'll come back later on and round it out a bit. I'm also going to come back through with a tiny bit of blue for part of the reflection as well. But that is going to be at the end of the video. I just want to bring that up so you don't think this is finished. Now the nose, I really could not see much in the way of detail on that reference photo. It really is just a few highlights and shadows. I added a little bit more, and that's another area I came back through with the blue later on. I added a little bit more than what was in the photo so that it wasn't just a big flat glob there. I had to look at other photos of cheetahs to get those where those highlights and shadows would be. Little dot of the highlight there. So notice when I do the highlight how the first layer, the white is fairly translucent. I usually use my transparent mixing white for that. I want to highlight, but I don't want it the brightest point. Those brightest points are just those little dots. Got a little bit on the inside of the eye there, which helps give it that glossy look. That little bit of a sparkle. Very much like what I did on the fish. Now I'm coming through with my liner brush. This again is that synthetic hog hair bristled brush. This one is from Hobby Lobby. It's one of their generic brushes. I've talked about that before. I actually really like their generic brushes. I don't normally like generic art supplies, but this is one I love. But I'm going back over and brightening things up now. And there are sections where I'm letting the previous layer show through. So this is creating that look of fur. And that previous layer is that sort of peach color. It just shows through a little, but enough that it gives me that look of fur. You're not going to create fur by mixing the perfect color. It's just going to look flat. I've got to come back through with some of these brush strokes, making sure to follow the direction of the fur, looking really closely at the reference photo there. I don't want these to be too long. This fur is very short right here. As the fur gets longer, I will make longer brush strokes. Really paying attention to where the lights are now. If I go too light, it's not a big deal. I can always come back through and glaze over it. But it makes my job easier if I pay attention to that reference photo as I work. Now the liner brush is one where you can see my hand is a lot closer than I typically paint. But it's still back. I don't have my hand over the bristles. Building up some of this mass of fur in here. And these are overlapping and in large clumps. They're not just a bunch of individual stringy strands. That will not look right, especially for the fur inside this guy's ear. So I've switched to a larger round brush because, again, I want larger clumps here. I was getting too many stringy lines with that liner. One thing I really want to encourage you guys with is to be confident in your brush strokes. Don't be timid and barely let the bristles touch. And I mean, if you're doing thin lines, then yeah, barely let the bristles touch. But for the most part, I mean, as I'm doing the fur here, you don't want to just barely let anything touch. It won't look right. Be more bold, and especially in something like this where it's a little bit more stylized, you can really see my brush strokes. I'm not going for super realistic. I need to make sure those brush strokes are confident as I add them. If I'm very timid, it shows in the finished painting. I would rather see bold, incorrect strokes than timid, incorrect strokes. I mean, if it's wrong, but bold is going to look better than the timid ones. So here the fur is very short, so I'm just doing little dabs in here, or sketchy lines, not really dabs. One thing that is really good practice, if you're working on strengthening your lighting on your work, if you have a tendency to depend too much on detail and not enough on your lighting, your shadows, your contrast, then one of the best things that I think you can do is take a small painting, a small piece of paper, something very small. I'd say in the range of 2 to 4 inches in any direction, and paint your landscape, paint your animal, paint that. You can't do well, you can, but it'd be really difficult. You're really not going to be depending on your details, and you're depending on your lights and your darks. Do these little thumbnail paintings. It's a really good way to practice focusing on your contrast and not just depending on detail to make something look realistic. Now for the fur, as I get onto the bridge of the nose, that I am going to do a little bit different. I am using a very, very light brush stroke because I want this to look somewhat velvety and soft. The fur is so short there. Whereas everything else, I'm actually making little brush strokes. So there, I break my rule about dry brushing because I'm almost, not full on dry brushing, but getting close in order to create that velvety look on the bridge of the nose. There's not a lot of paint or water on the brush when I get to that section. Now here I'm coming back through and sketching in some of the blacks because obviously going over it the way I did, they lightened up a lot, which is okay because I can still see where they go. I'm going to leave most of this face in real time, and then we'll speed through the rest of the body because it's pretty much all the same thing. It's just a matter of changing the direction of your brush strokes, depending on which part of the body you're working on. You can see I've taken that black now and really deepened the color on the most centralized portion of the ear, the deepest portion there. Creating more of that shadow underneath the upper eyelid. Just that little bit adds so much more dimension to the eye. It makes it look so much more realistic. This paint isn't terribly thick right now. I've got a fair amount of water mixed in with that Mars Black so that I do get that more translucent look. And at this point, I'm still mapping out a lot of where my lights and my darks go, and so it goes very, very slow. I'm constantly looking up at that reference photo. I'm using a round brush here, just getting some of these smaller little black sections in. This is a good point to notice too how dark I have the side of the face here and the top of the head. Everything's very, very dark. Really note this point and come back, look at the difference between here and when I finish it, how much lighter this gets by how I'm going to paint the lighter colors over it. But I need this dark here to peek through in order to create that texture of fur. And this is how I'm going to work if I'm painting a dog or a cat or anything really. I'm going to get these darker colors in so that the lighter ones have something to, this is the shadow in between all of the lighter hairs. It's too much paint on the end of that brush. I've got to wipe some of that off. There we go. Still a bit dark, or bright, so I just dab that to tone it down. So I add a little and smudge that out because I don't really want brush strokes there. I don't want that to look like fur that's very, very smooth on the bridge of the nose. Very short fur. So I've mixed this lighter tan color. This is my unbleached titanium white. There may be a little bit of white in there. Some burnt sienna and a tiny bit of black. So I get more of a brown color instead of just a pale pink peach color. The black is just enough to kind of neutralize it and create a little bit more of a grayish tone. Now, when you're painting, and I've talked about this before, the canvas that you choose makes such a huge difference. If I were doing these type of brush strokes on a very rough textured canvas, it would not look like this. It would be an absolute mess. The rougher texture is great if you're working with a palette knife or painting the impasto style where you really have that thick paint on there where the paint needs a lot to grip to. When you're painting like this with the finer details, you want to go with a very, very smooth surface. The great thing about this part being in real time, it's not so much that you're seeing the technique that I'm using, it's that you're seeing how slow the process is. Don't rush through this. Take the time you need and really look at that reference photo. And as I layer the brush strokes that I'm doing now, they are the same. I'm just going to continuously kind of sketch these in here and just keep layering until it looks how I want it to look. But it's the same type of movement that you're seeing me do now. It's the same that I'm going to be using for the rest of the cheetah. The only difference is the direction that the fur goes in and how long each of those strokes are, depending on how long the fur is in that area. Most of these brush strokes that I'm doing, that was too bright. Most of these brush strokes that I'm doing, they are slightly curved. Very, very rarely will I do completely straight lines. If you really look at them, most of them are curved at least a little bit. It looks more natural than a bunch of very straight lines. The straight lines end up having this very wiry feel. And I don't have to wait very long for this to dry the way that I'm painting here. These brush strokes dry within a few seconds. At least enough that I can go back over them. Now, if I were to glaze a color over all of this, I would either use a hairdryer or I would let it dry for a bit longer, because if you have one spot that's wet and you didn't realize it when you glaze over it, that spot can lift. But for something like this where I'm just layering these brush strokes and hair strokes, I don't have to stop and let it dry. I can just keep layering. Of course, I am working on larger sections, so by the time I get back to a previously painted section, it's going to be dry because it will generally be more than a few seconds before I get back to that area. But it's not something where I make one brush stroke, let it dry, make one brush stroke, let it dry. So we'll go ahead and speed this up because it really is just the same thing over and over. This area by the eye that I just did, it's very, very short fur, so again, brush strokes very short. It kind of changes directions quite a bit in there too. Start brightening some of this up. The majority of the light colors you're seeing me use here, it's coming from the unbleached titanium white, not actually white. While I will come back through with a bit of white, I want the majority of this, the highlights, the unbleached titanium white is so nice because you get the brightness without being straight flat white. Very, very rarely when you're painting an animal, if an area on them is white, very rarely will it actually be white that you use to create that. White will be mixed with another color, but not just straight flat white. And especially with the cheetah, most of this isn't going to be white anyway. But be careful with your white. I see that a lot where people will paint a white dog and they think, well, I just need white paint. No, you need whatever color is in the background. If he's sitting on grass, some of the green is going to reflect into the coat. If he's on a couch that's blue, the blue is going to reflect onto the coat. You're not going to have that much white. So here, again, I don't want white anyway, but I can get these nice highlights without having to mix it with another color just by using that unbleached titanium white. That was one of those colors for years I wouldn't buy because it seemed so wasteful. Why would I buy it when I could just mix a little bit of brown, a little bit of yellow, and there, with the white, and there I've got it. I love it now because it is so much easier. It saves so much time, and that I don't have to mix it every time I need that color. It's a color I use so often that it was definitely worth starting to buy. And so now it's one of the colors that I go through more than anything else. That one along with my regular white and black. I go through those colors a lot. You can see around the nose. Look at how I shaded the black. It's not just black nose, brown bridge of the nose. I've got that where it kind of fades out. Pulling some of the burnt sienna into this to get that nice golden color, but I am going to come back over that with highlights. For the whiskers, I'm just using my liner brush. Now the dark section underneath the nose, where actually the mouth, it's not just a black line. It fades. There's a shadow. The black, it has a lot of contrast when it's up against those upper lips. Lips? That's not the right word there. But the upper section of the mouth, that is much, much harsher. And as it fades down towards the chin, look at how that fades out. And that is going to be the case for most animals that you paint or draw. You don't just want to put a straight black line there. It's not going to look right. Pay attention to the shadows and what areas should be harsh, in this case the upper section, and which areas need to fade out, the bottom section here. I'm using my liner brush to add some of the smaller little black dots I need in there. This is always the part that gets to be a lot more fun. I don't personally enjoy the earlier layers. They're frustrating to me because it looks terrible and I just want to skip ahead to the later layers where it's fun, the little details like this. This to me is the funnest part, where you get to sit there and do these last little details that make everything come together. And I do recommend break things up. Notice that I did not just paint the entire body all in one shot. That would have been frustrating and you start to get very overwhelmed. I focused on the face and then I moved on to the neck, and then I'll do the body separately, one half the body than the other half. But break it up into little sections. So here's that unbleached titanium white, really making these outer edges pop. Now here, the direction of the fur starts going, it's pretty vertical here because this is the side of the body and this is just the perspective of the the cheetah. If I went completely sideways, horizontal, when I get into this outer edge, that's going to throw the perspective off. This fur in here is a lot thicker, and so the brush strokes are going to be quite a bit longer than the other areas. And it is so important to pay attention at that point to what direction the fur is going into. So I'm going to move on, and I've got to do some more detailing up there, but I'm going to leave that alone. I'm going to move on to this side of the body. I'm going to do this completely separate from the other side just because this side is black and white, the other side has color, and it's going to be easier for me to keep my palette clean if I'm only working with black and white right now. So I'm going to work on the entire black and white section here, and I've got to darken this up a lot. And so I've mixed a much darker gray. I'm using a fair amount of water, and this is a large filbert tack-on bristled brush. The bristles are a little bit stiff because it's old and damaged. I'm still making sure that I'm moving this in the direction of the fur because I'm not smoothing this out. Even though I'm going to be painting fur over all of this, if any of this shows, I still want it to just add to the look of fur. So I've just got to move that brush in the right direction. But I've got to get this a lot darker in order for the lights that I want to put on over to show up. If I left it pale like it was now, I would never get this dark enough. It doesn't work real well if you try to paint all of your darks in between the lighter colored fur. It's so much easier if you lay down the dark first. I know it's scarier, but lay down that dark first and then paint the lighter fur over that. So I'm going to let that set, and I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, but now I'm working with the darker brown. And to mix this brown, I believe I just used the burnt sienna mixed with black. And I'm not worried too much about those spots. I can still see them through. I'm going to have to repaint them anyway. One of the other things that I really like about having painted the face and having the face pretty much finished before I move on is no matter how bad the rest of the body looks as I work, it's not as frustrating or as intimidating because I know it's going to look like the face soon. It just makes it easier for me. It's these little mind games we play with ourselves. So now that I have the dark in there, I'm switching back to the black and white and just going to focus on the fur here. Really watching the direction and how long each of these brush strokes needs to be. And this is being applied the exact same as how I did on the face. The only difference is how long each of these brush strokes go and which direction. And even these lines, most of them are a little bit curved. And while I am working in between those black spots, some of this is layering over it. I know I'm going to come back through and better define some of them, so I'm not being super careful. As I paint, I'm constantly thinking of ways, how can I make it look the same, but get those same results faster? So that's basically what I'm doing here. I've learned over the years of painting these that it's easier. Don't worry too much about every little brush stroke being perfect. I can go right back over it. Not a big deal. And I know that coming back through and brightening up these or darkening up the black spots as needed later is way easier than taking the time to keep them clean now. Now here on this leg, I've really got to watch the direction of that fur. It twists and turns all over the place, but I've got to get it right because that's what's determining the underlying bone and muscular structure, that along with your highlights, where your highlights and shadows are. So I can't just put a bunch of random lines all over the place. It will look terrible. I've really got to watch that reference photo. I had someone recently send in a question. I don't remember if I mentioned this to you guys last week or not, but she sent in a question. She's wanting to paint or draw tigers, but she's trying to do it without a reference photo, yet she wants them to be realistic, and she's having a hard time learning to make them look realistic without the reference photo. you've got to have a reference photo. That's just how it works. None of us are going to memorize what a tiger looks like and have it absolutely perfect. If you've painted 1,000 tigers, yeah, you're going to get to the point where you can draw it without a reference photo. But that's a lot of tigers to paint before you get to that stage. When you're starting to paint something, you really want to look at a reference photo. That's not cheating. There's nothing wrong with that. That's what artists do. We find a good photo and we refer to that to create our own painting from that. So don't ever feel like you've got to get to the point where you're not using reference photos, that they're like training wheels of some sort. They're not. That's what we use when we paint. That's what artists use. All of us. Well, all of us who paint photorealism or realism. And just to be clear, I don't say that to mock the person who wrote that in. That will actually be a Q&A coming up. But it's something that I hear a lot from people, thinking that using a reference photo is somehow not right, not proper. It's not going to, you've got to work without it to be really good. No, that's definitely not how that works. It's one of those things that I hear a lot from high school students. I'm not sure if it's their friends or who's been telling them not to use reference photos if they want to be good, but it's the exact opposite. You want to improve on something? Use a good reference photo. Now here, I would definitely recommend go to wildlifereferencephotos.com, look under Cheetah, find this reference photo. I can't share it here because that would violate their terms of service, but you can go look this up yourself. Look at the photo. You can see what I mean by it's kind of boring as far as the lighting goes. There's not anything terribly interesting, but look how just making this adjustment with the black and the white on one side and then the color on the other, suddenly this painting, this reference photo, it's so much more interesting. And next week we'll be seeing the same thing with the flamingo that I'm painting in oils. Look at where I'm really focusing on where those highlights go, how I've got them catching the top of the leg there, or kind of like his knee. And this is where, as the artist, you can hype up the contrast a bit. That wasn't that bright on the reference photo. I made it a bit brighter just because I felt that it would look better on my piece. Coming back through now with the black, building the sketchiness of those black spots a bit where I went over it more than I should have. So now moving on to the colored section, I'm mostly using my unbleached titanium white. I have a little bit of burnt sienna and black in with it to tone it down. The fur does change direction quite a bit over here, and I will overlap some of this color a little bit into the black and the white so that it has a nice transition from one section to the next. I don't just have a straight line going all the way down where color ends and black and white starts. That was a really redundant way of saying that. I'm keeping these pretty fast because, again, this is the exact same thing that we saw on the face. Same type of brush stroke. Now, even though they are the same, you do want to make sure you've got variation. That's something that I see happen a lot, where people will do one brush stroke, it looks great, and they make every single other one look exactly the same. Make sure you're twisting and turning that brush, getting it going in the direction that the fur needs to go in. But do watch that it's not too uniform. I've switched to a smaller brush when I get into these darker areas. See, that's faded just a bit into the black and white sections. Now this one, I am not following any basic rules. There's no one single light source. I'm kind of all over the place with this as far as where my light source is. I guess this would be multiple light sources. It's not necessarily terribly accurate. I'm going for what I think balances the piece out nicely on this one. So this is my violet color, and I am now glazing over that backline. Normally, if I use this brownish red color or any type of orange colors in a piece, I'm almost always going to use a violet or a reddish violet color mixed in with that. So that's a little more than I wanted, too purple. So I'm mixing a little bit of my burnt sienna into this. And it's not that you always have to use those colors together. I just love how they look. They complement each other so nicely. And I'm just glazing right over my lights and my darks. I had to make sure that everything underneath was completely dry. And that burnt sienna just tones that purple down so nicely. It gives me this beautiful rich color. I'm pulling that into this back hip as well. The colors that I'm using here are so translucent, I'm not even going to have to repaint the black spots. I can anywhere that I need to be darker, but for the most part, they're all fine how they are. Very, very translucent. I'm using a fair amount of water in with that mixture for that glaze. And I do have a video, if you've not seen it, showing you how I glaze with acrylics. I'll put a link to that in the video description. Come back through here and add some more highlights. This is mostly with that unbleached titanium white, using a round brush here. And this is that stage that makes such a big difference, getting those highlights, those last layers. This is a small filbert that I'm using here. Also a tack-on bristle. Do not want to fill this in solid, making sure it stays very sketchy so it looks like fur. I think sometimes creating the really sleek, smooth fur can be more difficult than the poofy fur because you need it to look like fur, but you don't want it to look like a Pomeranian. So it may take you a few tries to really get that to look how you want it to. Just don't give up, keep layering. So here you can see I'm taking these highlights just up the back of the neck here, little bits here and there, and it gives it so much more dimension. Darkening up a few spots, adding a few more. So this is the last day. I'm just adding little bits of detail here and there, adding some of these highlights on the fur. Now that everything else is in, it's a lot easier and less scary to see where I can go brighter on areas of the face. Like, it's a little scary before you get the rest of the body painted in. Notice that I'm not just putting highlights everywhere. I'm kind of going very sparingly with these. But having just those few, it has a much more impact than my grammar today. It has a much bigger impact than if I just put these highlights everywhere. Then they wouldn't really look like highlights, I just brightened everything up. Just little bits here and there. Now onto the goldfish, I'm going to finish these up. I am going to be glazing that same violet color that I used, or magenta. Glazing that and then smudging it out with a clean dry brush. And look how nice that looks. I mean, it just makes such a big difference. Those specific goldfish, no, they don't have magenta on them, but it's kind of a surreal painting, so I figure I can do what I want there. But I just love how much more that gives it that bit of a pop. I've also taken some of that magenta and put it into the cheetah's eyes as well. Want those eyes to glow a bit more, so I've pulled some more of my burnt sienna in there, a little bit more yellow. I'm taking a pale blue now, and for those outer sections of that highlight, I like to have that white dot in the middle, but the outer edges of the highlight will almost always have this blue tint to it. The reflection of the sky or whatever is around it, but it's not usually just going to be straight white all the way through. Going to use a little bit of that blue on the inner corner here of that eye over the black. And on some of the goldfish. Just a little bit on the upper section. And that is it for this painting. Okay, not totally it. A little bit more blue on the nose. Pretty much anywhere that's black right in that centralized area, I've put blue. Now, I did not put blue anywhere else on the cheetah, though. This is kind of helping to keep that focus up in that area. It's the only area that that specific color was used. But there is my finished piece. Let me know if you guys have any questions.